Chapter 6 The Luthier. After arriving in St. George, Utah, Richard rented a large suite in the nicest hotel he could find. It was about one-third the price of Manhattan, and since it was summer, he had no trouble arranging for an empty room on either side. Richard was a relentless disciplinarian when it came to practicing the violin. 10 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week was not uncommon when there was a deadline to be met. The date of his next concert was set in stone, and he knew that he would be gearing up and digging in as hard as ever while his violin was being carved. At the same time, Richard realized the need for a little rest and relaxation, so after checking in, he took a deep breath and decided to lay down. After closing his eyes for less than 15 minutes, he toyed with the idea of seeing some of the sights. As much as he had traveled the world, southern Utah was one place he had never been. After thinking about where he actually was, he commented under his breath, "Of course, I've never been to Siberia in the dead of winter either." 20 minutes later, Richard was back in the Blazer, driving north on the freeway, somewhat refreshed, yet also more cynical than ever. As he passed another exit at the other end of town, he contemplated St. George. St. George and the Dragon. Richard's grandfather had told him numerous legends during his childhood, and while they usually concentrated on Niccolo Paganini and master violins, his grandfather had also covered just about every other topic in history as well. Richard had loved them all. Richard pondered the great knight's deeds that had earned him sainthood. St. George, the pillar of chastity and bravery. He was almost considered the inventor of chivalry itself, the protector of women and their virtue. Richard continued up the freeway and looked at his desolate surroundings. Looks like the dragon burned the place up before giving in. He couldn't imagine a luthier choosing to set up shop in the middle of nowhere. There were no great concert halls, no large opera houses, no cathedrals, no old-world art and culture, and most of all, no customers. It didn't make sense to him. Why southern Utah? Why not Cremona? After driving a few more miles, Richard unfolded a map he had purchased in the hotel gift shop. Leeds wasn't on it. "Probably not worth mentioning," he grumbled, while tossing it in the back seat. He then retrieved a set of directions that he had printed off of the Luthier's internet site. "At least this violin maker is somewhat up to date." Richard chuckled. Less than 24 hours had passed since he was in Carnegie Hall, wishing that the Luthier had been dead for at least 250 years. Richard pulled off the only exit leading to the small town and slowed down. As he eased off the gas pedal, it felt like life itself was slowing down. Even his pulse seemed to subside, and he loosened his grip on the steering wheel while relaxing in his seat. He had forgotten that small towns had a unique feeling all their own, and that the people there were different. Michelle had come from a small town. The south end of the tiny community consisted of a few quaint homes, weathered barns, and sun-baked pastures. Richard found himself smiling and returning a wave from some children playing at the side of the road in an irrigation ditch. It had been a long time since anyone had waved at him that didn't know who he was. It took less than 3 minutes for Richard to reach the north end of town, and as far as he could tell, Main Street was the only road that didn't dead end after a couple blocks. The last signs of civilization were a post office and a small store. As he continued north on an old weather-beaten highway, he began swerving around potholes in the asphalt and decided to inspect the map again. Richard still hadn't spoken directly with the luthier. He had simply left a message on the answering machine after calling Samuel to make sure that the Luthier was expecting him. Once Richard committed himself to something, he dove right in. That was his style, though he had found himself questioning his decision ever since arriving in Las Vegas. Richard stopped the Blazer right in the middle of the road. "You're joking." A small sign, half hidden by the sagebrush, read, "Violins," with an arrow pointing toward a washboard gravel road. If Richard hadn't already traveled so far, he would have turned around in disgust and headed back to New York City right then and there. He shook his head in frustration and closed his eyes for a moment before finally easing the Blazer off the pavement. After only a few feet, rabbits began leaping in front of the vehicle's tires at regular intervals. Richard had to step on the brakes more than a dozen times. After traveling over half a mile, he passed over a cattle guard and found himself scanning the horizon for cows. "I wonder if he makes his own hide glue." The map directed Richard through the middle of an orchard. While trying to convince himself that it would all be worth it, he noticed large branches drooping with the weight of ripe cherries. Richard almost stopped the Blazer so he could pick some, but decided to wait and ask. He hadn't had fresh fruit off the tree since he was a boy. His eyes widened when an immaculately groomed vineyard came into view. The grapes were turning colors, and Richard began wondering if the Luthier had his own label. Richard always had time for fine wine. He preferred the unusual and extraordinary, yet had never heard of any wines coming from the Nevada or Utah desert. The soil looked excellent, and the thought became intriguing, at least as an unusual wine. Just as Richard wondered if there really was a violin shop after all, he emerged out of the trees. There it stood, rising out of the sand and sagebrush, the largest violin shop that he had ever seen. It was enormous by anyone's standards, and Richard's jaw dropped. He was used to seeing small, crowded shops tucked away in the corners or alleys of large cities, not huge buildings in the middle of the desert. "Amazing," he whispered while looking up. The shop was hexagon-shaped and over 60 feet high. Most of it was made from modern materials, yet running up the center of the surface facing him was an ancient stone stairway painted in bright pastel colors with gigantic snakes on either side. Richard parked his Blazer next to a white Mercedes, unable to take his eyes off the stairway. The fangs and expression of the Aztec serpents were mesmerizing, and he tried to clear his mind and collect his thoughts. Who is this man? What is all this? If he really does know the secrets of the old masters, where did he learn them? Richard looked toward the top of the stairs. He had always been fascinated with ancient America, and even though the colors looked too fresh to be original, and he had never heard of any Aztec ruins that far north, he had the distinct impression that the center of the structure was genuine. But how could it be? He wondered, while glancing back down at the ancient characters carved in stone. He then wondered if some of the more fantastic legends about master luthiers could actually be true, as images of dragons and sorcerers crept out of the deepest recesses of his mind. He thought about his grandfather's most unbelievable stories and found his imagination running wild. Witches and black cats, cobwebs and secret passages, bats in the belfry, rats in the cellar. Who knows, he wondered. With all the stories he had heard as a child, what could he expect? What would this man, this master luthier, be like? Richard opened the door of the blazer and was greeted with a gust of air so hot that it took his breath away. He felt like he was in the doorway of a blast furnace. When he finally stepped out, the sand quickly warmed the soles of his feet. He became concerned for his bergonzi and hurried toward the front door and the shade of a canopy. A sign read, "Come in, you are welcome." But Richard found himself instantly entranced by the music coming from inside. He became spellbound and listened to the complete last two movements of the Elgar cello concerto. He didn't move until it was over. "Magnificent," he whispered out loud. "Insightful, truly inspirational." Richard then realized that he was using some of the exact same words that he wished Julie would use to describe his own performances. Maybe this Luthier is for real, if he can lure myself and players such as this out into the desert. Richard was sure that he recognized the musician's style. There was a distinct flamboyant flair at the end of each phrase, and as soon as the music ended, Richard grinned, turned the handle, and pushed open the door. Looking up from the cello chair was a small Asian boy, missing both of his front teeth. His mother was standing at his side. "Is it as you wish?" a middle-aged man asked in a heavily accented voice. His black hair was pulled back tightly in a short ponytail and contained wisps of gray. His eyes were mere slits, and his pointed beard twitched while he spoke. Even though he couldn't have been much older than Richard, he was hunched forward as though he were the boy's ancient, humble servant. His simple, homespun clothing and leather loafers had a distinct Chinese flavor. The luthier patiently waited for the boy's reply without glancing toward Richard and the open door. "Yes, sir," the boy replied. "Good." The luthier smiled. "I am, as always, your servant." The boy's mother had been staring at Richard the entire time and finally exclaimed, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Gaspar. My name is Christopher." "The pleasure is mine," Richard found himself replying after closing the door and shaking the boy's hand in amazement. "It's not possible," Richard thought, recalling the concerto he had just listened to. Yet the cello was still in the boy's hand, and the sheet music was resting upon the stand. Richard was stunned, yet too polite to ask if the boy had really been the one playing. He began wondering if the music was really as good as he remembered. After quietly packing their belongings, the boy and his mother finished their business with the luthier and left, leaving Richard speechless and still wondering. Richard turned to the luthier. "How is it that I've never heard of Christopher before?" "He is very young," replied the luthier while straightening up. "But people should know." "People will know soon enough," the luthier responded. There was a hint of remorse in his voice, as if he regretted the thought of it. Realizing that he had not properly introduced himself, Richard apologized while holding out his hand. "Pardon me, I'm Richard Gaspar." The luthier removed the elastic band from his hair and shook his head. His eyes opened wide, and he replied in a louder, more deliberate voice. "Yes, and I am Jean Diego Luthier. How was your journey?" The luthier seemed to transform right in front of Richard, and he added the word luthier in such a flowing manner that Richard wondered if it was a title or actually his last given name. "Fine," replied Richard. After a slight hesitation, he added, "But that's quite a desert you have out there." "Yes, it is." The luthier motioned toward a water cooler. Would you like a drink while you cool off and relax? Richard placed his bergonzi on the table and wiped a bead of perspiration from off his brow. The temperature in the shop was comfortable, but he still hadn't recovered from the heat outside. Yes, thank you. The water cooled Richard's entire body the moment it touched his lips. He sensed that it had not come from any ordinary source and looked on the glass water bottle for any labels or markings. There were none, and as Richard watched the Luthier drink, he could tell that he savored every drop. After lowering his cup, the Luthier asked, "Do you require anything before we begin?" Richard's head had tilted all the way back while taking his last swallow, and he found himself staring at the ceiling. There were thousands of pieces of tonewood hanging above his head. "A violin," Richard responded in a daze. He was not naive about the value of fine violin wood. "Yes, I know," commented the Luthier. "Shall I make it now, or would you like to take some of those pieces with you so you can finish it later?" Richard lowered his gaze, and the Luthier smiled. They both laughed when Richard realized what had actually been asked. "No, thank you. I'm fine." "Good. Do you have any time constraints, or are you free?" The Luthier's Eastern mannerisms had now been entirely replaced by a jovial, hometown good-naturedness. "I'm as free as a bird," Richard answered, using the same phrase he always used when asked if he were married. "Except to prepare for my concert in 6 weeks." Richard patted the top of his violin case. The zippered flap was overflowing with music. "Very good. I usually start with a brief tour of the shop. Would you like that?" "Certainly." The Luthier led Richard through the entry toward the work area. "I suppose that you have visited a few other violin shops over the years?" "A few," replied Richard, while looking around in fascination. "Good. Take a moment, then tell me. How does this one compare?" Richard looked back into the cavernous expanse. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. The ceiling was over 15 feet high where he stood. It tapered even higher, and all of it was covered with more fine tonewood than he had ever seen in his life. The front of the entry was simple and modern, but further back it took on the appearance of his grandfather's parlor. Every culture of the human race was represented along its walls with paintings, sculptures, musical instruments, and ancient artifacts, some of them dating back thousands of years. Richard then noticed that the Luthier's motions had created a small breeze that could be seen in the feathers of a colorful costume worn by Aztec priests, and for all appearances, it appeared genuine. After forcing himself to keep moving, Richard's gaze worked its way toward the woodworking area. The end was beyond his view because the shop was one large open area wrapped around the foundation of the stone stairway. Richard would have had to walk in a circle the length of a football field to see it all. It gave him the feeling that the violin shop went on forever. Richard pointed toward the artifacts. "Those are fantastic. And from what I can see from here, this is the largest violin shop I've ever heard of. Are there other workers?" Richard then realized that his was the only vehicle outside now that the Mercedes had driven away. "I need the room to move about freely," responded the Luthier. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes. "I also need to know how their voices will project in a concert hall and appeal to a large audience." Richard nodded. He could appreciate the necessity of playing instruments in an open area to see how the sound would project. Then he wondered about the Luthier's large audience comment while looking around at only a dozen chairs scattered throughout the area. "There are no other workers," the Luthier assured Richard. He continued with a proud smile. "My oldest son, Schuyler, also makes instruments, but he's at basic training for the National Guard. Otherwise, he would be here. Any more questions before we begin?" "No, I'll just listen." The Luthier appeared impressed with Richard's response and smiled as if to say, "Good answer." As the Luthier stepped away from the wall, Richard watched as his mannerisms and accent changed yet again. It was subtle, yet Richard could swear that while the Luthier had been standing next to the Aztec costume, the muscles in his face became tense, his voice settled into the back of his throat, and his eyes had become wild. Knowing what the ancient Aztec priests were most famous for, Richard felt a chill run up his spine. Yet any concerns that he might have felt were quickly traded for amazement and curiosity while proceeding around the corner of the stone stairway. Every conceivable occupation was represented there, and in the very back was one of Richard's favorites, a blacksmithing area. Anvils and iron fixtures dotted the floor, while tongs and hammers covered the walls. Richard felt as though he had been transported back through time, and took a moment to look up the flue of the largest forge. Richard spent the next half hour asking 100 questions, and by the time the Luthier finished answering them, Richard noticed a distinct southwestern drawl in his voice. Richard couldn't help comparing the Luthier's different mannerisms to ventriloquists and impersonators he had seen on stage, yet each of the Luthier's characteristics came across as sincere and genuine. By the time they finished exploring the blacksmithing area, Richard was surprised that he wasn't keeping a pioneer family with a broken wagon wheel waiting just outside the back door. The welding area was modern, yet even though it meant duplicating many of the older blacksmithing tools, it was also complete and self-contained. The casting area included smelting ovens, wax injectors, and mold-making equipment, while the gold and silversmithing facility had everything necessary for cutting and faceting precious stones. Richard inspected a dozen different molds for making violin, viola, and cello cases. He then realized that the 2 violin cases at Carnegie Hall were different and must have required their own unique forms. He had almost forgotten that the old masters had made their own cases, and some of the most fantastic legends his grandfather had told him were about the cases and not the instruments themselves. Richard stood speechless in the middle of the machine shop. There were mills, lathes, and grinders. The size of some of the machines was overwhelming, and he couldn't imagine how a 500-ton hydraulic press could be used in violin making. Yet by that point in the tour, he had asked so many questions that he decided not to pursue it. The laboratory appealed to Richard's analytical nature, and the technology there was state-of-the-art. It included a scanning electron microscope, spectrophotometers, and computerized testing equipment that boggled the mind. It would take a dozen lifetimes to collect all these tools and learn how to use them, Richard declared. The Luthier turned. "I don't spend much time in these areas anymore. I used most of this equipment to help find answers, also to make my tools that will now last a lifetime." As Richard turned, his fingers brushed along the edge of a bench covered with black silk. From the Luthier's response to all of his earlier questions, he could assume that the large diamonds resting on its surface were genuine. Beside them were gem-setting tools and 2 swords, a long one and a short one. Their perfectly polished surfaces shimmered in the light, and a strange wavy pattern ran along their cutting edges. Lying behind the swords were two unfinished wooden sheaths or scabbards. The scabbards were in the process of being intricately carved and inlaid with the jewels. Richard didn't know much about swords or sword making, but it was obvious that they were extremely valuable. The luthier took note of Richard's gaze. When I do need something special, all of these tools become indispensable. He quickly moved away as though he didn't want to answer any questions about the swords. As they continued back toward the wood carving area, the luthier handled each carving tool with an expression of longing that Richard could have mistaken for as lust. While replacing a large steel gouge in its holder, the luthier responded as though he had heard Richard's thoughts. I do love them, Richard. My wife has never been jealous of any other woman, only my tools. Richard nodded with a smile, and while the luthier finished the tour, he thought of Michelle. Michelle was never jealous. She never had to be. She had an energy and a presence that kept Richard from wanting to spend time with anyone else. From the moment he knelt at the side of her bed, he knew that she was different. Not just different from any other girl, different from anyone. On the way back from her house, it had struck Richard that Michelle had only spoken 3 words. She had gone from being a complete stranger to his worst enemy, to his best friend, with only 3 words. Richard later found that she was always that way. Michelle carefully chose every word she spoke, and always meant more than she said. After retracing his steps back up the stairs to the front porch, Richard was greeted at the door by his mother. She must have been watching and waiting for me the whole time, he thought. Boy, does she need a life of her own. Well? Elaine sternly asked with her hands on her hips. I apologized, and she accepted, Richard smugly replied. He quickly continued into the study, leaving his mother speechless and wondering what on earth was going on. Richard didn't give her a chance to ask any more questions. He pulled out the bergonzi, switched on the metronome, and began practicing as though nothing had ever happened. He had played the piece 100 times before, but as Richard's mind wandered back down the sidewalk toward the old Pritchard house, he smiled. The music was different. This time, when he played, his violin had a small scar, just noticeable out of the corner of his eye, and he had a friend. When Richard and the luthier reached his main carving bench, the luthier pointed toward the ceiling. And most important of all, the wood must hang from the ceiling to allow the dry desert air to pass freely between each piece until it is fully cured. How long does it take? At least 15 years, replied the luthier in a solemn tone and manner. All of the other violin makers Richard had visited dried their wood in small piles on the floor, sometimes for only a few months. He remembered the nails in Stradivari's rafters and nodded. This luthier was different, very different. The luthier retrieved a ladder and pulled down 2 of the pieces. One was curly maple, the other fine-grained spruce. Even though Richard knew that it took 2 different trees to make a fine violin, it seemed strange to see them side by side and to hear the luthier describe each of their characteristics. Richard had always looked at violins as complete works of art. He knew better, but he still thought of them as though they had come from a single tree. It takes 2 trees to make a master violin, the luthier explained. One can never succeed without the other, and I travel the world to find the very best. Canada, Bosnia, and Germany grow the finest maple, while the spruce comes from France, Italy, and the Tyrolean Alps. I have obtained wood from other places, but it is extremely rare. Rare enough to be considered a miracle. The luthier talked for almost an hour about the wood and the trees he had cut. It was as if he were talking about his closest friends, and he made it sound like he had saved them by chopping them down. It became obvious to Richard that the luthier loved the trees even more than he loved his tools. They eventually made their way back into the entry where the luthier explained, "Each person who walks through my door is as different as these." He motioned toward the artifacts lining the walls. And the master luthier must determine the style, sound, and character of each instrument before ever lifting a tool. Straightening up, he added in a dramatic voice, "I make no copies. No master ever has. For copies can never have a soul of their own." Richard realized that every new instrument he had ever played upon was a copy. Richard loved originals. He was also impressed when the luthier explained that he mixed and boiled his own varnish from rare natural materials, so that each instrument would have its own texture and color. It reminded him of the master painters during the Renaissance, who had made their own pigments for their greatest works of art. "Follow me," beckoned the luthier. "My varnish is waiting." The luthier walked out the door and around to the side of the shop toward a metal bench covered with a canopy. Once they were in the shade again, the heat was almost bearable, and Richard found himself leaning over the edge of a boiling pot on a hot plate. There was a thick, dark liquid inside. "Now for your questions," offered the luthier, and he began stirring. Richard had asked 1,000 questions already, and he smiled. After thinking about it, he glanced toward the large stone serpents not far away. He had to know. "That matter," clarified the luthier before Richard could utter his first word. The luthier began stirring again and waited. Richard almost found it difficult to remember why he was even there. "Can you really do it? Can you make a better instrument than the Joseph Guarnerius in New York?" The luthier's face lost all expression, like a poker player refusing to betray any signs of emotion. "Better?" he asked while tugging at his beard. "Everyone's definition of better is different, Mr. Gaspar. What would you call a better instrument?" "Louder overall," Richard explained, "and if it were possible, even deeper on the G string." He knew that he was asking for more than any violin could ever deliver, but after remembering the sounds he had heard in Carnegie Hall the day before, his list went on. More fullness on the D and A strings, and an even sweeter E than my Bergonzi. His voice became melodramatic, but most of all, the ability to sway the crowd. With Richard's last comment came a noticeable raise of the luthier's eyebrows. "I see. Tell me, Mr. Gaspar, was the dark violin in the leather case loud and deep enough for you?" The luthier had asked the question quietly, except for overemphasizing the word loud. "That instrument is why I'm here." Richard raised both arms to help emphasize his words. "It had incredible power. It was unbelievably loud. It could overpower even the largest symphony's forzando." Richard continued praising the dark violin. Then his comments became critical. The tone was so wonderfully deep, yet it had a character that was hard and unforgiving. It didn't want to respond to light, intricate phrases. "I will take that as a yes," replied the luthier. Then he whispered, "And the light, golden brown violin in the powder blue case, was it sweet enough?" "Yes," Richard whispered back, while looking directly into the luthier's eyes. He had not forgotten how sweet the violin really was, and here he was, standing in front of the man who had made it. The luthier smiled. Then, to Richard's surprise, he winked. "Tell me what you mean by fullness, Mr. Gaspar." Richard was taken back for a moment. "Body, what some refer to as soul." Richard purposely used the same word that the luthier had used earlier when referring to his instruments. Richard didn't really believe that violins had souls. It was simply a word he used to describe instruments he thought had extra flavor. The luthier firmly declared, "The Guarnerius you speak of is one of the finest violins in the world, Mr. Gaspar, with a truly great soul, and many performers would choose it above the instrument that I will make for you." The luthier stopped stirring the varnish and directly faced Richard. "Yes, I can give your instrument volume. Yes, I can make your instrument sweet. And yes, I believe I can give it the soul you need. But," the luthier paused, "you must sway the crowd." The luthier began stirring again, and Richard became anxious. "How long will it take?" "Including the time that I must take to finish that violin," the luthier motioned toward the top of the violin shop, "it should take about 6.5 weeks. Richard cringed at the mention of 6.5 weeks and squinted his eyes while looking toward the top of the stairs. There really was a violin there, set back from the edge and barely visible from where he stood, basking in the sun. When Richard began shaking his head, the luthier stepped backward into the blazing heat. He let the sun's rays soak deep into his skin, and he smiled. 6 weeks. "How much will it cost?" asked Richard, anxious again, now that the time frame met his needs. "Your violin's total cost will be $35,000, Mr. Gaspar, including tax." The luthier tapped his stirring stick against the inside of the pot as if to say that there would be no debate concerning the price of the instrument. "All right, then, let's do it," Richard responded. Without another word, he pulled out Samuel's check and handed it to the luthier. The luthier barely glanced down before lifting the varnish pot off its stand and calmly placing Samuel's check beneath it. It burst into flames and was quickly reduced to ashes. "What the hell are you doing?" Richard demanded. Richard seldom swore, but he figured that it was as appropriate a time as ever. He stared at the luthier with rage and even considered adding a few more expletives. After glancing down and realizing that his fists were tightly clenched, he didn't loosen them. "Hell has nothing to do with your friend's check. What I do here, or the violin I will make for you, Mr. Gaspar, you must pay for the violin." "What difference does it make where the money comes from?" "For your violin, it matters," replied the luthier.